especially in the European ecosystem, there is like a bit of like a shyness by default, like that you really have to prove everything every time. So I think for us, the main challenge was like just standing up and saying, okay, we have to fundraise now. This is the right time. We have to get going and we have to be ambitious, and then just going for it. And then the moment we did that, it was actually relatively easier than we expected.
In Europe's startup scene, there is a familiar story: brilliant talent, world-class labs, and a lot of hesitation to turn it into big companies. Elvis Nava decided to skip the hesitation. While finishing his PhD at ETH Zurich, he realized that his research on robotic dexterity couldn't just stay in the lab. The only way to make it real was to build a company around it. A bit more than a year later, Mimic Robotics has just raised 60 million oversubscribed seed round to bring physical AI to factory floors. Robots that learn human-like skills directly from human demonstrations. In this episode, Elvis shares how he turned science into company, what it really takes to raise deep tech money in Europe, and how his team overcame what he calls the European shyness, that instinct to prove everything before you actually start or even share it with the world. We also talk about why, even as a young startup, he decided to spend time building community, hosting hackathons with OpenAI or Mistral, and why he believes Europe's robotics moment will only happen if founders help build the ecosystem, not just their own company. Let's get into it. So, Elvis, you were deep into your PhD at ETH Zurich, working on dexterous robot hands and generative models, work that could easily have stayed in academia. Do you remember the exact moment you realized this shouldn't just be a paper, but this could actually be a company?
Yeah, actually, that's quite an interesting question because I think maybe differently from other type of PhD projects, I think what I was doing, I think, okay, maybe you could get like some paper out of it, but like for it to really work, it couldn't hope, like it would be a bit hopeless for it to stay in the lab. Like I think normally maybe you can make some, I don't know, hardware gadget or some other invention in the lab and that question would apply. But in this case, I really felt that like if you are basically building this type of end-to-end models for robotic manipulations, which is basically what we do now at Mimic, like we train models with imitation learning to do manipulation in industrial use cases. It's basically impossible to get that to a degree in which it actually works beyond just one paper if you're in a lab. I mean, as cool as the lab can be, like, that's just the truth. So essentially, kind of it's almost funny because like the only way that even the research could be done was the company. So in the end, it just had to happen. And so essentially, it's more about maybe me personally wanting to do a company or not. But the question about this specific topic becoming a company was like kind of decided from the beginning, essentially.
Did you have the topic and then realize that if you want to pursue this topic, then it's only the way out is basically doing a startup? Or was it more the other way around?
I would say like when I started the PhD, maybe I didn't have like a super precise topic, even though I actually did have like a proposal at the beginning, dexterous manipulation. I think with time, I mean, I was already a lot into generative models and like LLMs and so on, but I realized that that whole thing was exploding already in a way that like I couldn't hope to get involved to the degree that I would have liked as early as I would have liked for that to happen. But I realized that essentially I kind of was thinking deeply about like wanting to do a startup in AI and wanting to do on which topic. And then I realized, okay, what is the topic that if I don't do the startup now, in 2 years from now, I will be very mad. And that's essentially, I decided actually the stuff I was actually doing at the PhD actually ended up really being that topic. And that's when I decided to go ahead.
So walk us through the moment where you also met your two co-founders who seem to be around you, but not doing exactly also a PhD.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, so Stefan and Stefan were already doing projects in the soft robotics lab. So Stefan Weyrich was working more on the hardware side for the hand, like he was building dexterous hands. He had this nature paper on like 3D printing a hand. But as he says it himself, like within that paper, again, like it's the classic thing that you do it for the paper and then afterwards it doesn't go anywhere if it's just in research, right? And then, and that's the idea of like doing something more rather than just the paper, right? And then at the same time, Stefan Gravert, the other Stefan, like we have the two Stefans within Mimic, he was working in actuation, electrostatic actuation and electronics within the lab and also doing like basically papers and projects. And kind of very randomly, very serendipitously, we found each other within the lab exactly around the time that Stefan Weyrich wanted to do a startup on the topic of the hands. But at the beginning, it was more about like the whole hardware side. And on my end, I had these ideas that I told you about just now that like about wanting to do a startup in AI and deciding on what to do it on. And then then realizing that actually doing it on end-to-end imitation learning for robotics was the right move at the time. And then the perfect mix came out quite randomly, but like quite effectively of like actually doing it on the dexterous hands.
And maybe, and I might be biased here a little bit because I'm working for the AI Center, but according to my observations, the AI Center is encouraging entrepreneurship, but it feels that a few researchers actually make the jump. So what made that possible for you? What support structures or mindsets, be it at the ETH, be it at the robotics lab, helped you take the leap? Or was it purely like just the three of you and a lot of strength and kind of curiosity to make the leap?
I think what happens in not just in the eye center, but like in general, I mean, maybe also in Switzerland plays a bit of a role. I think if you are at that level, especially in that field, especially in the past few years, you can very easily have a very easy life. Like you can basically just get paid a lot of money, like quite easily. I mean, you have to be really good, but then given that, the default path actually gives you a lot of return essentially. And I think maybe you would think like, I don't know, in the US, like you have this natural kind of push towards maybe startups if you're in SF or something. I think in Switzerland in general, like people just are like, it's much easier to have a very comfortable life, which is a good thing. But then essentially people maybe are not pushed as much to do like entrepreneurship. But I think given the fact that our context was a bit anomalous because we were really working in this type of, like, I would say our type of robotics research was not very common, and like we didn't fit very neatly into this type of like path towards just being hired in an AI lab. Like Gemini robotics didn't exist at the time, right? Like I wasn't doing like projects that were like necessarily relevant at the time in the LLM stuff you would get hired for immediately. And so all of these things together, plus the push that we have to do entrepreneurship, helped us a lot. Together with the fact that the AI Center and also some other programs like Talent Kick and so on actually push in the right direction. So when I say this about Switzerland, I just mean about like the overall environment of like being chill. Doesn't make you push, but like then there's a lot of initiatives that push you, I would say. So that helped us definitely. Yeah, exactly.
And once you guys decided to go for it, like how did the first 3 months look like? Was that like surprisingly easy or, like super chaotic, which you never expected? How did it go?
I think it depends if you count the first 3 months from when we actually were doing the fundraise, or if you count it from after incorporation. I would say the first like 6 months in between when we were getting like the term sheet and when we actually incorporated were complete chaos. Actually, maybe the first 3 months after incorporation were paradoxically very nice. Even though we just started, like it felt like a milestone had happened, even though it was just the start. Because maybe as a context, we were also coming out of ETH and so on, and we had like some bureaucracy with like licensing. And I think now with the new director, Frank Flussel, for entrepreneurship, it's actually much more streamlined process. And I think we were some of the last ones to deal with like complete and utter chaos. And so essentially, yeah, it was a bit like annoying, I would put it this way, like kind of doing the spin-off at the time. And then once it was done, and we were so relieved that we were so happy to work together. And then for like the first 6 months, even though there was so much stuff to get done, like office space, hiring, we worked so much. We were so happy and like we were not stressed at all. And we actually got so much more stuff done, like 10 times more stuff done in like the first 3 months after incorporation than like in the year before, I would say.
And maybe coming back also to the technical aspect. So Mimic is, as you yourself said, unusual, how it also started and also the research is based on. So you're not just building models, you're building machines. So robotic hands with 16 independent joints and tendon-driven fingers that move almost like a human hand, trained with imitation learning. For people outside robotics, what does that actually mean in practice? Like, how does that level of dexterity change what your robots can do or what problems you can tackle?
I think it's more like, I think from outside of like the field of robotics, of the niche of robotics, I think it's quite hard to picture what is the difference sometimes. Maybe people see humanoids and they're like, okay, this is like a stupid robot because why is it shaped like that and so on. I mean, we don't do humanoids. Actually, one of the taglines of our posters sometimes is that we don't build humanoids, but we do build like the humanoid hand. So it's kind of a 50-50, right? And so the thing is that traditional automation has a very specific way of achieving a task, which means that you have this like very bulky robot that moves super fast, but with extremely high inertia. So like you have to absolutely make sure there's like no humans in the way, and you have to program like either you program exactly the movement, or you add some type of small computer vision component on top that like allows it to detect something, and then still basically performs pre-programmed movements, but maybe adapting the target or something like that. Essentially, if you want any hope of robotics actually achieving, I would say, uh, essentially, let's say, plug and play freeform labor, that thing doesn't work. Like humans, when you hire them, you're not like spending months programming what they're gonna do. They just tell them what to do and then they do it, right? And obviously, you would think this is far-fetched, but actually now with these latest advances in imitation learning, you actually can start doing this. But then the question is that it's a bit of a completely different paradigm. Now the robots don't have to move like lightning speed fast. You can build them to be a bit more flimsy and less precise so that they have less inertia. They are like safer to be next to people. And then you have these other AI models underneath that actually tell it what to do and where to move and kind of continuously self-correct, right? All of this stuff. And so essentially, it's a very different way of looking at robots, and it's only really possible in the past 2 years because of these advances in imitation learning, using generative models that were not there before. And so really completely moving away from like kind of this bespoke coding and maybe small layer of like computer vision towards really having the end-to-end model that takes everything the robot sees, everything it senses, and then just outputs the actions. This is a very different way, and that's why we need like the robot to be shaped differently, because then you just need to train it on data, and then the question is like where the data comes from, and then it's like the data that is human shaped is actually easier to get.
And a huge problem normally is that, like, especially in research, you find an exciting technology, but then you try to find a problem for it that you can solve, so to say. But you quickly then started pilots in manufacturing and retail. What was this very clear from the very beginning that this is your target market, so to say, and really the place where you can also make money?
And so basically, I think like obviously when we began, like it was more about the capabilities of a robot. So we didn't start with the vertical. I also think like, I mean, often, especially European, but like in general, some VC, I mean, advice is always kind of like just start from the customer problem, right? Which makes sense. But this is a bit like, I mean, Mimic is also unusual because we're trying to do more of this like really foundational technological play. Like if you go to OpenAI or Anthropic, what are you talking about if you tell them focus on, I don't know, accounting? Like that makes no sense, right? So essentially, this only works if it's like kind of a horizontal play in this regard. But that doesn't mean that we don't get the customers. Actually, we want the customers because we want to kind of validate what we do against some use case, right? And then actually those use cases came quite early on. And then based on what we could find and what was also technically feasible, we decided to adopt these verticals. So I would say, yeah, like we didn't start with those in mind, but they came pretty early. Some of these came even before actually incorporating, essentially. Yeah.
I mean, on that point, like, what's the hardest part about, on the one hand, shipping something which is kind of research grade AI or also horizontal, and then precision hardware, on the other hand, which needs a very particular use case?
Yeah, I think like, yeah, like exactly. So that's because like essentially our hardware is designed in a way that it's like, it's exactly different from this more traditional robotics. So the hardware is not designed for the use case per se. And that's why like we have like this hardware that is like a human hand that like is flexible and you can just do many things with it, right? So at the time of us designing the models, designing the AI models and designing the hardware, we are not thinking about the use case. But then we use the use case as a benchmark to make sure that ultimately what we do makes sense, essentially. So that's basically the difference there. And like even on the hardware side, we have to make it a bit universal and general purpose.
Yeah, makes sense. And I mean, leaving the application of robotics, like, and founding a robotics startup in general, like, what would you say most robotics founders underestimate about building this, like the difficulty, the tech, data you need, the iteration cycles? Like, what had you move faster founding such a company?
Yeah, I think actually like the kind of thing that the robotics people underestimate. I'm not sure I'm in the position to answer this question the best. Like I can just defer to like people who are way more experienced. For example, I don't know if you go to the founders of Antibiotics or like Raf D'Andrea, the first thing they will tell you is that reliability is the most important thing, and it's like it's easy to get to 80, and then it's super hard to get to the last 20% of something. And that's basically something that we are still building towards, right? Like essentially because right now we're quite young. Like the startup was founded like a year and a half ago at this point, and the systems and also the hardware is still kind of pushing towards like this high reliability. And so for us, it's not that much about me teaching other robotics founders this topic, but more about me hitting this all the time, basically. But I would still say, yeah, like the moment you have a hardware system, then the reliability, the uptime is going to be a huge pain, and then you just have to eat it and you have to deal with it. And it's not so much my learning, but something that I can definitely confirm from others. Yeah.
And I mean, what would you say about the point? Because I mean, on this podcast, and we heard that a lot from software founders, that done is better than perfect. And you kind of have to work scrappy. So how would you look at this advice, working scrappy, done is better than perfect, from the perspective of a robotics founder, when you talk about this 80% doesn't get you where the client needs to go?
Yeah, I do think, yeah. So I do think if you are doing a more traditional robotic startup, you really need everything to work perfectly, because you're essentially building a system that's meant to do one thing, or maybe if it's programmable, it's many things, but like it's still kind of boxed in into some domain. Then it really is worthless almost, unless it's really getting close to the 100%, right? And that is a bit the problem, that like you could not really reason in this domain of like done is better than perfect. And that's basically why all the robotic startup basically failed, like almost everyone. But I think with this new type of robotics, since it's really about some methods that are like fundamentally capable of solving general purpose challenges, but we have to build towards that. The clients themselves, they don't expect me to go there today and like just do everything perfectly. They understand the strategic play as well. Like this is very different from before. And so essentially for me, yes, this actually does apply now, because it's about actually getting out, getting the data, getting the throughput, showing improvement in the models. And this you cannot afford to wait until the hardware part is perfect. Otherwise, I'd be still here like doing nothing on the software side, essentially, right? So that I think now starts applying the moment that you're just using learning to do robotics, and that your customers understand the strategic importance of what you're doing and are willing to, let's say, do pilots before actually the real deployments, I would say. So this, I think, in the new wave, it probably applies while before.
And would you say that type of mindset is different to what you experienced in your research field? Like, was your research focused on 100% and absolute accuracy, or was that kind of the same because you were researching in that field
No,
already?
yeah, I think absolutely not, right? Like, I think if you're in research, it's even worse. Like if you're in research, it's like done that works once, it's better than perfect. I would say, like, that is just the truth. Like, if you're doing research, I mean, even the best people like Stanford, Berkeley, I mean, I've gone to these labs, like, they are all the best, are still extremely scrappy in implementation, right? Like this is just how research works in these domains. And so there it's even worse, right? It's basically really getting the proof of concept done and showing it once, and even if it falls apart after the camera stops recording, right? Like I would say, like in the startup, it's like a bit of a notch above that. You really have to get something going, and that it really has to work. And I think that has been the big difference. Like when just doing the video can give you, I mean, okay, pre-seed, if somebody asks you for anything in pre-seed, I think they are unserious. It should be a team. But like after that, you really have to learn about stuff that you would never encounter in the research side. Like getting from done once to done is better than perfect, right?
Very interesting insight, because you would actually expect something completely different. So actually, startups could actually learn a lot from this perspective of, and especially I think European startups who sometimes have the tendency to be perfect until they go out. But if you then hear about a research paper where you only show it once and are happy with that, then actually there is more to learn from research than would be obvious at first sight.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And speaking of research, research to a certain extent is also about like individual mastery. I can solve this myself, this type of thing. And then building a company is all about that. You need to build a team which can solve problems. Like, how did you experience that, building a team coming from academia?
Yeah, that was a very interesting thing to learn. I think, like, I mean, when you're a PhD student, okay, maybe you are hiring some students and that's it, right? Like, you still have to kind of choose somewhat, but like in a very limited way. And then again, like everybody you're hiring is always project based. Essentially, if they're not good, they don't work out. You can always kind of like it will be done in 6 months at most, right? While like essentially having to build an actual team, like you have to think about long-term strategy and like about what works out, what will be needed when, like, and who long-term is a really good fit for the company. I think this is very different, and like it's definitely a skill that we had to learn, and that I think like we are continuously learning. And yeah, it's 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 been very interesting to learn that. Like also like hiring is like such a time sink, but you have to do it.
What was the hardest domain where it felt difficult to delegate or to build a team to take this over?
I think probably, I still think that in terms of the research direction, in terms of like actually like the whole, I would say the research taste and research direction, it's really hard to let go of that because like if you can trust somebody to really do that 100%, like sometimes this type of person, like they're just like a founder, they just go and do their own thing, right? Like who, so I think like the challenge for us has been to get the best possible team while basically like it's impossible for me to like, and for also for the others to be like hands off in many regards, right? But that's obviously that shouldn't happen, like to be hands off, but like at some point you still have lots of stuff going on, but you still have to really give feedback on the actual research direction every day, right? And I think essentially now that we are going to go to the next stage of the company, maybe we can even increase the team and like make this even better. But it's really hard. Like, I think like, especially this applies to researchers funding companies. Like if your research, it's, I don't know, let's say if the technology is something that already exists and you're just commercializing a small part of it or something, maybe sure. Maybe there's a huge talent pool that knows more or less what you know. And the only difference is that you're more entrepreneurial or like whatever. But if it's not, if it's really something new, then how do you even get like the founder? If the founder has to be the researcher, then how do you actually create a company that scales with like you in leadership and like somebody doing the day to day? That's really hard because like there's like maybe 10 people on earth that could do it, right? I mean, maybe now in robotics is getting quite big, also this generative side of robotics, so maybe there is like, I don't know, 200, right? But it's still very small. So I would say it's like that's the most challenging part for a researcher, like the research taste.
And you were hinting at something that I would like now to talk about the next chapter of also the company, because this week is also a big one for you and Mimic, because you just announced Mimic's oversubscribed seed round. So roughly 60 million US dollars with lead investor Elia and Speed Invest as a co-lead. And I noted down like there are participation of First Kind, 10x founders, Sequoia Scout, Laura Modiana from OpenAI, and a few other angels. Take us inside that process of actually getting to this round. How did you approach the race from the very beginning, and what did you learn about how investors think about robotics right now?
I think that was very, very fun. Obviously, very stressful, but I think it was very fun. I think it's like the right time to scale up a company like this. I think, I don't know, especially maybe in the European or like Swiss, but maybe just European ecosystem, there is like a bit of like a shyness by default, like that you really have to prove everything every time. Like, I don't know. Sometimes I have the feeling that for some points of view, the Series A target, maybe, okay, the seed fundraise target for a startup like us should be to solve like some tasks that if you looked at it objectively from the point of view of what US investors value, you would need to be a $10 billion worth company to achieve that. So I think for us, the main challenge was like just standing up and saying, okay, we have to fundraise now. This is the right time. We have to get going and we have to be ambitious and then just going for it. That was the main thing to just start doing. And then the moment we did that, it was actually relatively easier than we expected. We still needed to like, I mean, fundraising is like extremely painful, like extremely like very long days, calls back to back. But like essentially, I would say like we hear that like on average it takes way more time than it took us to do it. So it's definitely, it was very exciting. But yeah, we went out with this target, we hit this exact target, and we got some very nice investors. Elia, Speed Invest are like co-leading together. Elia is like the lead, and essentially, like we really like them. Like I think with Elia, we had conversations already for like several months before. Also, when we went to Paris for our several trips, also when we visited Mistral, we already had the opportunity to know the Paris ecosystem. And I think also knowing the Paris ecosystem really well really helped us a lot. So I would say that was like definitely one of the decisive parts was like kind of getting to know like specific ecosystems like the Paris one and so on, and overall European ecosystem, and like establishing Mimic as somebody that can get this next step done. And then once that is the understanding, the perception, and the truth as well, then that was the time to go ahead. But if it was just about, I don't know, the natural, and I think, I say like the natural instinct of a company in Europe is to be way more shy than what we actually ended up doing, I would say.
And also to give some numbers. On the one hand, like how many interactions with investors did you have? Also, in which time frame did you raise this round? And then of course also how you overcame this shyness, because obviously you weren't shy and just reached out, which also the names show.
I think overall the fundraising process took us like 2 months, I would say.
Hmm.
Obviously,
Okay.
after that, there is like some bureaucracy and so on. So it has been more than 2 months since then because now we have we've been closing for a while, like in terms of like just final details. But like the process itself, I think it took us 2 months. And in terms of like calls, I mean, like obviously hundreds of calls all the
Hmm.
time, right? Like hundreds of leads and then like multiple calls per lead. So that is like the very painful part because if you want to do it well, you have to squeeze it all together into a very short span to build the momentum. And so I think that we did pretty well. And I think again, the shyness is not really like it's not about like not wanting to reach out to investors. It's more about like understanding that this is the market, this is what is valued, and just going for it instead of like trying to undersell yourself or like trying to under raise and then expect the others to raise you up. Like you should just go out with what you think is right and just go for it. And like inaction is an action by itself, right? So just go out and then at some point we decided, okay, now is the time to go ahead, and then we did it pretty fast. I would say if you are building in a space that is important, that is understood to be important internationally, you should just listen to that and go ahead.
I see the time is running out, but I really want to touch upon a last topic that you were mentioning yourself, and it ties well into what you were just discussing, why it was easier for you to actually raise and why you only raised it in 2 months. And this is the ecosystem part, because you said you spent a lot of time in the Paris ecosystem. I remember that you were part of hackathon with Mistral and Hugging Face. And in May, you teamed up with OpenAI and Locky Robotics to host a major hackathon also in Zurich. Um, for me, who has been there and saw all the like the final like products out of it, it felt more like a not only a weekend project, but almost like the start of a new movement, so to say, in the European robotics. So my question here would really be like, how do you see this ecosystem gaining real momentum, and also why do you think it's important to spend time on? Because as a young or early founder, you could say, hey, let's just focus on our own startup. Let's do our own thing and not concentrate on all these events and hackathons and stuff like this. But you obviously seem to gain a lot of like insights, connections, momentum out of this, spending a lot of time with the community. So can you share a little bit your views and also why you think this is super important?
Yeah, no, of course. I think like obviously as a startup you do have to focus on what you're doing, right? You're not gonna do a hackathon every week or anything like that. But like I think essentially if you're aiming really at building something that is like essentially a foundational play, like maybe in the overall Europe, like I don't think there's that many that are competing with us even today, like that the market is really hot, like in Europe. You have to still convince people that you are worth it in that regards. And then how do you do that? Like, how do you convince people that you're worth it, both for investment, but also for talent that work for you? Like doing this type of ecosystem work then is really important. So essentially, doing this hackathon, we did the hackathon with OpenAI and the Zurich builds, basically in May, as you were saying, doing like being a judge for the Mistral one, the Mistral hackathon in Paris. I think it helps kind of like showing yourself to the world, right? I mean, all of these students and others that came for the hackathon and like now want to work for us and so on. And also all of kind of the people involved in the ecosystem actually realizing like that, okay, Mimic is a thing. Like I don't know, it's not just some random YouTube video that you post and nobody cares, right? So I think interaction in person of that kind is extremely important. And that absolutely helps us a lot. You cannot, unless, that's the thing, like exactly, unless you already had this type of, I don't know, 3x founders pedigree or something, and you say, okay, I can do this because of just who I am, and that's it. But you have to put yourself out there more if you want to build a very ambitious type of company like what we're trying to build.
So as our time is running up, like I'd like to finish with a few rapid fire questions. So the first is a tool or setup you can't live without.
Okay, this is really hard. Probably this is a really hard question actually. I rapid fire, but like I'm not like extremely attached. I mean, okay, Slack, whatever. Like I think Slack for the company is really important. I don't know, like it reminds me of this post from like these OpenAI people using Slack and building the entire company around it. I basically use this for everything within the company, but I'm not particularly attached to tools.
And best advice you ignored and we're glad you did so far.
Probably to focus on some extremely small company vertical to get early traction.
What is the most impressive robotics demo you've seen this year?
Dyna's Robotics folding t-shirts live at Coral in Seoul.
And finally, one word that describes the next 12 months for Mimic.
The next 12 months?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I would say scaling and throughput of data collection.
Thank you very much for being on the show, Elvis. And if anyone has more questions or wants to actually work with you, I know that you're currently hiring. Where do they find more information about you and Mimic?
.com or on our LinkedIn page. Yeah, that's the two places.
Awesome. Thank you very much and see you soon.
Perfect.
And now we would love to hear from you. How did you like it? What should we improve? Do you have any suggestions, ideas, or dream podcast guests? Please let us know.
Thank you and see you again next week.